Hey guys, my name is Joe and welcome to Potato Recap. In today's video, we are checking out the 1995 movie A Walk in the Clouds. But before we get started, please like, share, and subscribe. And without any other delays, let's get started. The story starts in 1945 when World War II was over. U.S. Army Sergeant Paul Sutton goes back to San Francisco to see his wife Betty. After a quick courtship, he married her the day before he left for the Pacific. He has emotional scars from the war and often has memories that come back to him. Paul's reunion with Betty is tense, especially after he finds out that even though he has written her almost every day, she stopped reading his letters after the first few, and keeps the hundreds of unopened envelopes in a footlocker. He is, however, determined to make the marriage work and hopes to start a new career. She tells him he has to keep selling chocolates door to door, so he heads to Sacramento. On the way, he meets Victoria Aragon, a Mexican-American graduate student whose family owns a vineyard in Napa Valley. When two men start bothering Victoria on the bus to Sacramento, Paul steps in and beats the men up in self-defense. Because of this, all three men are kicked off the bus, and Paul finds Victoria crying further down the road. When he learns she is pregnant by her professor, Paul offers to introduce himself to her very traditionalist family as her husband. The two eventually reach Victoria's family's vineyard after a strenuous walk. A stunning cloud surrounded Aragon's mansion and the enormous grape field that Victoria calls Las Nubes. Paul took a ring from the chocolate he was selling and put it on Victoria's finger before they even got close to the location. Not only is Victoria's father Alberto furious that she wed a man beneath her social standing without his consent, but he is also angry that she did so. Her grandfather Don Pedro nudges Paul to stay and assist with the harvest, defying his initial plan to stealthily leave and continue his journey, while leaving her family to believe he abandoned her. Paul, an orphan, becomes more attached to the family during the harvest and discovers the pleasures associated with their customs, history, and way of life. He and Victoria struggle to suppress their growing attraction and feelings for one another. Alberto and Paul get into an argument which makes him want to leave. Don Pedro called him as he was leaving the estate. The elderly man offered him a unique brandy he had created 21 years earlier. Paul returned the man's smile and never shied away from him out of respect. He also accepted his invitation to join him inside for a drink. While working with other maids, Victoria was sewing a cloth in the laundry room. She made an effort to remain calm and smile in their presence. Victoria cried, though, when the maids questioned her about Paul. She kept on sobbing as she left. Don Pedro and Paul were seated at the winery's table. The elderly man was already aware of the couple's issue. He attempted to advise Paul, but Paul asked to leave because he thought a bus would pass by the valley. Don Pedro forbade him from leaving. Instead, he asked the man to stay another day so they could both see the wine being blessed at the festival the following day. Paul had been so kind to the old man when they first met that he could not refuse his request. Napa Valley was already getting dark, but the two were still drinking. They are accompanied by musicians playing a love song in the background. Paul learned the lyrics from Don Pedro as he sang a song for courtship. Paul sang along even though he was off-key that night and was already inebriated. Don Pedro, Paul, and the musicians went to the mansion in front of Victoria's room's balcony after practicing the love song. Don Pedro took a position so that he could instruct them in song. He gave the men the go-ahead to begin. Everyone in the mansion, including Victoria, was awakened by the romantic music playing. Victoria noticed Paul when she peered out the window. Victoria just stood in her pitch-black room while grinning. Paul was singing passionately in the background while gazing out the window. On the other hand, Don Pedro loved to see how men used to court women by singing in front of their windows at night. Paul's goal is to make amends and win Victoria back, not to court her. Victoria was supposed to turn on the lights, so Paul was waiting. Once the lights are on, the lady reportedly accepts Don Pedro's apologies. Victoria's room is still pitch black even though the song is about to end. Paul nervously stops singing. He had to decide whether to pursue Victoria or leave her alone because he was already married. Paul decides to leave Victoria and Napa Valley permanently. Paul can still hear the music playing as he walks through the vineyard. The romantic song ended and he noticed Victoria's room lights coming on. Paul was overcome with emotion but kept on moving. The celebratory wine blessing began the following day. Paul dressed up as a soldier for the occasion and attended the ceremony. Victoria rode onto the scene on a horse to the cheers of the crowd. She looked absolutely stunning in her white dress and hat. A smile, though, seems to be absent from her face. Paul and Victoria both appeared to be alone. The entire Aragon family is present at the party. Victoria continues to catch Paul's attention. On the other hand, Victoria was aware of Paul but chose not to smile. The ceremony was presided over by Father Couturi, who prayed before blessing the grapes from Aragon's vineyard. Paul was on the balcony, and Victoria looked there, but she couldn't see him. Paul left after taking one final look at the situation. Victoria called him out of nowhere. When she approached him, she had 2 wine glasses with her. Victoria raised a glass of wine and toast and told Paul they were enjoying their what-ifs. Paul looked at Victoria while attempting to smile despite having sad eyes. Later, Alberto and Father Couturi drew nearer to them. The priest was introduced to Paul as his son-in-law by Alberto. Paul and Victoria were in disbelief. Alberto praised Paul as a brave soldier who also assisted them in the vineyard harvest. Victoria pushed her father away. Victoria was already aware that she couldn't continue to be with Paul. Alberto didn't pay attention and announced the gathering, inviting everyone to his daughter's wedding later that evening. Paul has been officially given Alberto's daughter's hand. Following the announcement, the audience cheered. Victoria, on the other hand, was advised by Paul to tell the truth to everyone. Victoria said she would be the one to make the disclosure. Victoria no longer feels threatened by her father. Paul was pleased and gave Victoria a medal for her upcoming child. Paul was the most honorable person Victoria had ever met, and she thanked him for that. Before Victoria returned to her family, the 2 kissed. Victoria admits to her father that she is expecting a child on her own at last. Victoria's grandparents gave her a tight embrace as Alberto stormed out furious with his daughter. Paul was observing them before he left. Paul walked in to go back to Florida because he missed the bus. Thankfully, a car stopped and offered to take him to San Rafael. Paul entered. Paul was talking to the driver while maintaining a confused and vacant expression. What was the soldier doing there close by, he inquired. Paul made the unconscious comment that he was moving through the clouds. The driver made a joke about Paul while laughing. Alberto, who is still angry with his daughter, is drinking with his men in Napa Valley. While walking to the vineyard, Victoria, on the other hand, was reflecting on her experiences with Paul. Paul was having another nightmare while driving. Once more, he had a war dream. There was a child waiting for him when he opened the door. Victoria was wearing a white dress, as seen by Paul. The 3 joyfully strolled in the clouds in front of them while holding hands like a family. Paul was abruptly awoken from his dream by a blast. He was still in the car and it was already getting dark. Paul finally made it to Florida the following day. When he entered his apartment, he discovered Betty sharing a bed with another man. Paul maintained his usual composure. She betrayed him after he returned and made her his wife. Betty expressed her regret and warned Paul that their relationship would only make her miserable. Their personalities and life objectives are opposed. Betty handed Paul the annulment document she had already filed and was awaiting his signature. Paul realizes this as he is leaving Florida. He's already been annulled, so he can now pursue Victoria. Paul hitched onto various cars on the same day to get to Napa Valley. When there were no cars on the road, he would occasionally walk miles. Paul arrived in Napa Valley at last. At the table, Mr. Aragon was passed out and inebriated. He accepted Paul's apologies and gave him his blessing to marry his daughter. Additionally, he pledged to act as Victoria's child's father. In a fit of rage, Alberto yelled that he was already married. Paul immediately handed Mr. Aragon the annulment papers, but he threw them away. He told his men to get a gun because he intended to shoot Paul for his daughter's suffering. On the other hand, Paul insists on expressing his love for Victoria. Alberto ignored the warning and was furious with Paul for deceiving him. Paul screamed Victoria's name because her father wouldn't listen to his justification. Victoria opened her eyes and heard Paul's voice. She sprinted downstairs in a hurry. Every person on the farm is startled out of their sleep as the commotion continues. Alberto hurls Paul's way anything he can find. Included is the lamp, which was the last thing on the table. Mr. Aragon threw it to Paul with all his might. The lamp, however, ignited when it entered the vineyards. As he observed the burning of his prized fruit, Mr. Aragon remained sober. Paul immediately dipped his clothes into the water-filled barrel. He made an effort to put out the fire with it. Victoria assisted her father in rising by holding his hand. Victoria assisted Paul in extinguishing the fire. The Aragon family pitched in when the fire started to spread to additional vines because they couldn't stand by and watch. Farmers who had contributed to the success of the grape plantation for centuries made an effort to put out the fire. The wind blows, hastening the spread of the fire. It was no longer under control. To avoid being burned, they all moved away from the vines. Pedro, Victoria's brother, was trapped because the fire was so large. He had no choice but to jump over the flames to safety. Pedro's clothing caught fire there. The Aragon family, who were already in a safe location, yelled as they noticed fire surrounding Pedro's body. Paul arrived to save him with the help of a wet cloth he had brought. Paul, who covered him with wet clothing, successfully saved Pedro from the flames. Except for Alberto, everyone gave up and felt helpless to extinguish the fire. He cried out and ran to the vines to prevent his plant from burning. He was embraced by Dom Pedro and coerced to leave the flames. As they witnessed the enormous grape field being burned, Aragon's family and the other vineyard farmer sobbed. They suffer great pain as they watch the vineyard they have tended for centuries burn to the ground instantly. The lush green fields of Napa Valley turned black the following day. After the incident, Victoria saw her father crying. Victoria came up to him. As soon as Mr. Aragon saw his daughter sobbing and consoling him, his heart began to soften. He admits that he was worried about losing Victoria and everyone else he loved at that precise moment. He may not have the words to express how much he loves his family, but he does. Other than by giving them everything they require, he is unable to find another way to show his love for them. Mr. Aragon apologized to his daughter while sobbing like a baby. The fact that the first vines from Dom Pedro's ancestors were also burned makes Dom Pedro unhappy. On the other hand, they are out of vines to plant new ones. He cried as he informed Paul that Las Nubes was over. Paul felt sorry for them. They are left with nothing but themselves after losing everything they own. Paul decides to trek through the clouds to the hill where the source of life is buried. He continued to believe that the original vine was still in existence. Paul finally gets to the top of the hill where the vine is. Additionally, burned was the vine of life. Whatever the case, Paul carefully brought it to Mr. Aragon after digging it up. Everyone appeared hopeless as they watched the healthy vine turn black after the fire. Paul was still hopeful though, and asked Mr. Aragon to check the inside of the vine to see if it had been burned as well. Victoria's dad reached for his blade. He slowly scraped the vine's skin while trembling. It still has life inside of it. When Mr. Aragon noticed the vine's interior was still green, he joyfully screamed. After hearing it, everyone clapped and started crying. Dom Pedro exclaimed, "Las Nubes is still alive." He cherished the lovely moment. Mr. Aragon was very appreciative of Paul. He still respected him despite how he had previously treated him. Alberto Aragon cut a piece of the vine and gave it to Paul as a token of his appreciation. This represents Paul formally becoming a member of the Aragon family and being given the responsibility of restoring the vineyard. Additionally, Mr. Aragon favors his marriage to Victoria, his only child. Paul held Victoria's hand and gave her a ring before he planted the vine. Everyone showed the couple such a lot of support. In front of them, Victoria and Paul shared a kiss. The romantic moment was witnessed by everyone who applauded. The love of a family for which orphan Paul had been looking for a long time was finally discovered. While leading the restoration of the vineyard that flourished for centuries, Paul promised to walk with them in the clouds of the Napa Valley. even though he only recently met them.